80s fantasy and 80s Disney. Two incredibly distinct periods of film that each have their own devoted fan bases thanks to their dark, unmistakable approaches that have rarely been replicated since. But did you know that there's one nearly forgotten film that brings together dark Disney and dark fantasy in one classic yet brutal sword and sorcery tale featuring maybe the greatest dragon ever brought to film? It's 1981's Dragonslayer, a film whose dark and bloody approach to fantasy clashed directly with its reputation as an ultra-rare co-production by Disney and Paramount Pictures. In the decades since, director Matthew Robbins' film has quietly lived on as a cult classic alongside other dark live-action Disney films like TRON, The Black Hole, The Watcher in the Woods, Something Wicked This Way Comes, and more overlooked experiments of the time. But with creatures made by a then still up-and-coming Industrial Light and Magic, Dennis Muren, Phil Tippett, and more creators who had just barely broken through with Star Wars, it's a must-see for any fantasy fanatic. If you've been following my channel, then you may know that every January I like to cover a dark and obscure Disney movie, and Dragonslayer definitely fits that bill. But even among these movies, Dragonslayer is an absolute deep cut and is kind of forgotten. But when you look at the creators involved, you can't help but wonder why. Well, I'm here to find out. Journey with me once again to a world of dark and forgotten live-action Disney for a trip to the brutal fantasy world of Dragonslayer. The journey to Dragonslayer begins with two very different but very influential pieces of media that came to fame in the late 70s and influenced decades of stories afterward: Star Wars and Dungeons & Dragons. Now, I don't think I really need to explain anything about Star Wars to you, but the most relevant piece of its production for our video today is the creation of Industrial Light and Magic, also known as ILM, by George Lucas, with major creators like John Dykstra, Kenny Ralston, Dennis Muren, Joe Johnston, Phil Tippett, and more part of its original team. Of course, to bring Star Wars and then Empire Strikes Back to life, ILM needed a large team of effects workers that had a wide variety of specialties to make this galaxy far, far away truly work on screen. And while Raiders of the Lost Ark also employed ILM, the team had no idea when they would be called on again to make another Star Wars, and as such, needed a movie to keep the team employed. Of course, it's wild to think of ILM as being out of work today, and while the story of ILM's history will need its own video someday, its need for another movie, and preferably something completely different than Star Wars, led it to another Lucas collaborator: Matthew Robbins. Robbins had, like many of his future collaborators in the American New Wave movement, graduated from the USC School of Cinematic Arts and, as such, began working with George Lucas early in their careers. Specifically, Robbins helped write Lucas's short film version of THX 1138, and eventually had one of his early scripts, The Sugarland Express, go on to be the first theatrical feature film directed by Steven Spielberg. Afterward, Robbins and writing partner Hal Barwood would rewrite Close Encounters of the Third Kind, write Corvette Summer, which Robbins would direct as his first feature, and then eventually craft the script that would go on to be Dragonslayer. Specifically, Robbins credits Barwood as being the true fantasy fan of the duo, and pushing him to read J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, which would directly influence their film. Dragonslayer was born out of the combination of the Tolkien world and the dragons therein, said Robbins, plus the fact that suddenly instead of outer space, the technology at ILM could render a creature on a level unknown prior to this. The writing duo also credits Fantasia's The Sorcerer's Apprentice for the magical side, and the myth of St. George and the Dragon for the idea of a dragon demanding human sacrifices, who is eventually slain by a hero. However, the writing duo specifically wanted their story to avoid the common cliches of previous fantasy films, saying, "Our film has no knights in shining armor, no pennants streaming in the breeze, no delicate ladies with diaphanous veils waving from turreted castles, no courtly love, no holy grail. Instead, we set out to create a very strange world with a lot of weird values and customs, steeped in superstition, where the clothes and manner of the people were rough, their homes and villages primitive, and their countryside almost primeval, so that the idea of magic would be a natural part of their existence." And with the dragon as the film's centerpiece, ILM's many different departments would have plenty of work cut out for them, with the effects studio already attached to the script as it was shopped around to other studios for financing. This brings us to our other important piece of the puzzle, Dungeons & Dragons. While the tabletop RPG had no influence on shaping the film, and Robbins has said years later that he's still never even played it, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson's D&D was first published in 1974 and quickly shot to major success with more than 3 million players around the world by 1981, and selling about 750,000 copies of the rules each year. There was, of course, plenty of pushback and the rise of the Satanic Panic, another topic for another video. But it was clear that not only Dungeons & Dragons, but fantasy stories overall, were having their heyday, and studios were eager to capitalize. That led to both Paramount Pictures and Walt Disney Productions being interested in Robbins and Barwood's script, and with the two studios having previously found success in co-producing Robert Altman's Popeye, they once again teamed up to create Dragonslayer, splitting the production cost and dividing distribution, US and Canada for Paramount, international for Disney's Buena Vista division. And what I find really fascinating is that Disney, who was financially struggling on all fronts at this time, really had no concern about pulling any of the punches of Dragonslayer. Really, their only concern was that this movie was set in England. Yes, Disney, of course the medieval fantasy is set in England. But given that Disney, like usual, was all about Americana in their films, they insisted on American leads, which led to Peter MacNicol, then a complete newcomer and not yet everyone's favorite Ghostbusters character, Janos, cast as our young hero, Galen Brandwarden, and Caitlin Clark, no, not that Caitlin Clark, cast as Valerian, our female lead. So with all that said, what's Dragonslayer actually about, besides, well, you know, slaying a dragon? Set in the 6th century in the kingdom of Erland, Dragonslayer follows the young sorcerer's apprentice Galen, who serves the ancient sorcerer Erlich of Kraganmore, the last in the land. But when a group of peasants led by the young Valerian comes to seek their help to stop the evil dragon Vermithrax Pejorative, Ulrich is soon killed by the kingdom's royal guard, leaving the young Galen, now with a small bit of his master's power thanks to a magical amulet, to stop the dragon from terrorizing the land. The hiccup in this tale comes when Galen seemingly stops the dragon early on by collapsing its cave, causing the land to celebrate, only for Vermithrax to rise and make everything much worse. It's a pretty simple hero's journey, and the script by Robbins and Barwood is very focused on keeping its world very stripped down. One small kingdom, one specific conflict, and very little magic. Only our sorcerers good magic and our dragons dark magic, which feel connected to one another. And while I like its simplicity, which helps emphasize that this is a story about how the last remnants of magic and fantasy left the world, it does feel a little underwhelming at times. Ideas like a corrupt kingdom sacrificing virgin girls to the dragon to keep its people safe, yet the king secretly keeping his own daughter out of the lottery, are darkly compelling. But the kingdom isn't really explored all that much. The nature of Ulrich's magic and how it lives on in Galen aren't given much thought as it's used very, very sparingly. Galen's decision to become a warrior instead of only using his magic, and the forging of the titular spear, the Dragonslayer, is an interesting break from the linear hero's journey, but it's fairly quickly walked back. And what it means for this world to have its final embodiments of magic dueling to the death could be given a lot more weight and bombast. Being a co-production with Disney, you would think that a classical fantasy like this would be fairly tame and family-friendly, but what sets Dragonslayer apart is that it's absolutely cutthroat in a lot of shocking ways. It's not just about the deaths being bloody and brutal, but about who dies and how they die. Spoilers, obviously, for a 45-year-old film, but even when knowing Dragonslayer's reputation, watching this movie shocked me throughout it. Our lead wizard is bluntly stabbed through the heart at the start. The first virgin sacrifice we see is torched to death on screen despite a heroic escape attempt. Ian McDermott's priest is flambéed, complete with burning dummy. And our princess, who bravely offers herself as a sacrifice to spare her people, is killed by baby dragons when we think she could be saved, including her limbs being bloodily bitten off. These elements make Dragonslayer feel a lot less safe and predictable than what it seems like at first. And although the film still very much follows a classic hero's journey, the deaths and losses feel more like the dark and dangerous fairy tales and myths written centuries ago, instead of the cleaned up and box office friendly family movies that have adapted them in the time since. Reflecting on these decisions in the script, which became much more shocking when seen in the finalized film, Robbins said, "The reality of it may have been more than I bargained for." But Dragonslayer's bloody approach makes it of a piece with a lot of the other 80s fantasy films happening during the same time. And really, there's nothing else quite like 80s fantasy, and I really do love it, and I'm sure a lot of you love it as well. Just take a look at a few of these films. Excalibur, Highlander, The Dark Crystal, Legend, The Neverending Story, Clash of the Titans, Fire and Ice, Kroll, The Princess Bride, Willow, Conan the Barbarian, The Beastmaster. That's really just a handful of them, and they range from great to so-so, conventional to genre-bending, big budget to independent. But they all have this wonderful spark of imagination that takes classical thrills, often uses a darker, sometimes R-rated approach to stories that had previously been made more family-friendly, and most importantly, uses practical effects to bring really wild worlds and creatures to life. Now, not all of these effects work great, and sometimes the cheap, shot-in-your-backyard kinda look has its own special appeal. The DIY approach that evokes the charms of Dungeons & Dragons, where incredible fantasy adventures come to life in your own basement, the product of some imagination and a great story made with friends. Dragonslayer works really well within the confines of its budget. The scale doesn't exceed the cost, and its modest, earthy kingdom feels believable. Magic is more like tricking reality instead of a huge spectacle, and that makes it all feel just a little more real. But it also means you should adjust your expectations for most of this movie. It's also got a pretty strong score by Alex North, which gives the film a nice classic sweep. The funniest thing about it is that several years earlier, North had composed and recorded the entire score for Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, only for the madman director to throw the entire thing out. With North proud of his work and given the chance, he rearranged a lot of what he made for 2001 into the Dragonslayer score. Hey, waste not, want not, right? That's not to say that Dragonslayer is a bad movie. I really do enjoy it, and I think this will be very satisfying to other fans of 80s fantasy who may have overlooked it in favor of the more popular films of the era. It's just that most of the film doesn't wow me, except for one element. I think it speaks to both the quality of the effects and the somewhat forgettable nature of the rest of the film that Dragonslayer's most exciting and influential element is the dragon itself. While Robbins' film hides Vermithrax for most of its first two acts, I think that helps build up the story as a journey toward the final battle. It really goes all out in its dragon-focused scenes to bring the creature to life, with about a quarter of the film's $18 million budget devoted to the monster. At first seen in only brief glimpses, Vermithrax exists as a dark presence terrifying the land, slowly being revealed more and more until the first confrontation in its cave. A really awesome, massive set with a fiery lake and animatronics up to 30 feet long to bring the monster to life. Designed in concept art by David Bennett, sculpted for modeling by ILM's Phil Tippett, and then constructed for animatronics by Danny Lee, Vermithrax the dragon is brought to life by giant mechanical props, scaled down hand puppets, and stop motion animation, each of which are used for specific moments and actions to bring this massive beast to life. Flying, shooting massive jets of fire, attacking the actors, and running through its caves in a truly impressive, cohesive creation that really feels alive and dangerous. One important distinction here: Vermithrax as a clay figure is brought to life by go motion, not stop motion. What's the difference? Traditional stop motion, like the effects of Ray Harryhausen, are made by moving a figure one frame at a time, photographing it in 24 separate images for 1 second of film. It's extremely tedious, but makes amazing creatures that have a sharpness to their image, but lack motion blur that would add realism. Go motion, pioneered by Tippett and ILM, and first used for the Tauntauns and AT-ATs for Empire Strikes Back, use motion control armatures to continuously move the figure while it's being shot. This is made possible by computer-controlled motorized rods attached to the figure for smooth, realistic movement timed with the camera. It's a real step forward in animation that was sadly only really used for a short time due to the coming of computer graphics. Here it's really awesome, and in Dragonslayer it's another step forward in the history of ILM, taking an effect that was pioneered in Star Wars for only a few brief moments, and putting it to use for the most important creature in a film and used extensively. It required really rethinking the animation process, said Tippett, but what you can do very easily is change the speed on it. We had one of the very first little tiny Mac computers attached to something like 16 stepper motors. And the way that the stepper motors work is they have pulses that go out. And so Bess figured out what the relationship was between the pulses and the frames. When I'm animating the thing, it's happening in real time. You would count out 6, 12, 18, 24 so I knew where I was in time. I could see where I was in space, and that's how we did it. The only downside is that the matting used in these scenes is pretty rough. Essentially, go-motion rods needed to be used all over the dragon to move the head, neck, back, legs, arms, wings, and anything else that needed to move to feel truly alive. But that means these rods had to be matted out, and so Vermithrax was largely shot on blue screen and then composited with the set and the actors, instead of shot on a miniaturized set as was originally intended. And because of that, you get mismatches in lighting, black point, and overall connection to the rest of the scene. Some shots are more noticeable than others and sort of pull you out of the film at the most jarring mismatches. Still, I think it's really cool. And if there's one overall letdown with the film, it's that Dragonslayer's climax, which sees Ulrich resurrected to essentially be used as a bomb to destroy Vermithrax, is weak. We're mostly waiting for the dragon to strike as it swings by at super high speeds instead of being a true battle. Oh well. In the end, with the death of both Vermithrax and our sorcerer, Dragonslayer implies that the last bits of magic have died in this world. Sure, a little lives on in Galen, but it's the end of one age and the beginning of another, with hints of Christianity, still weak in the face of these powerful ancient forces, now taking over in the place of what came before. It's an interesting idea, but one that's not fully fleshed out in the film, just mostly suggested by a few scenes. And honestly, I'd say that's the case for a lot of Dragonslayer. Quite a few interesting ideas and some cool moments, but many of them leave something to be desired. The scares aren't quite scary enough. The action doesn't hit as hard as it could. The magic doesn't wow like it should. And the ending mountaintop battle between wizard and dragon is a lot cooler in concept and execution. And mostly I think that's due to the film's budget not quite being large enough for a truly impressive ending, and Robbins' direction not hitting the emotional highs that it could. In some ways, that benefits the uniqueness of Dragonslayer. The world of this film is much more grounded and subdued. The last bits of both light and dark magic have almost run out. The deaths are fast and brutal and known as safe, so a darker, more heavy direction works well for a lot of that. It's just that when the film should hit a crescendo, it can't reach it. So with all that said, how did this shockingly dark fantasy promoted by Disney under their family-friendly banner do at the box office? Well, as is the case with all of my other videos on similar subjects, quite poor. Released on June 26, 1981, Dragonslayer made $14.1 million at the box office, not able to overcome stiff competition at the time from Raiders of the Lost Ark, also from Paramount, who saw it as their priority over Dragonslayer, and opening in 6th place. Not terrible, but definitely a disappointment when paired with the film's $18 million budget. However, most audiences and critics were very positive about the film, and its darker, more grounded take on traditional fantasy subject matter. Still, its less family-friendly approach and execution made it a harder sell to a major mainstream audience. The result is a film that was essentially a cult classic from the moment it hit theaters. It probably doesn't help that the Don Bluth animated arcade game Dragonslayer came out 2 years later, and is probably what people think you're talking about when you say the exact same sounding title. But over the years, Dragonslayer has gained a devoted but small following, including creators like Guillermo del Toro and George R.R. Martin, who have cited it as an influence on their own fantasy work. Still, the poor performance of the film brought a premature end to the Paramount-Disney co-production relationship, severing the connection to the point that Paramount heads Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg would jump ship from Paramount to Disney in 1984, and eventually kickstart the Disney Renaissance. But if there's one positive effect from Dragonslayer's failure at the box office, it's that after many years of trying to make more mature, less family-friendly but still big-budgeted movies work at the box office, and continuing to run into failures in marketing, perception, and overall acceptance from audiences, Disney finally realized that a brand new division needed to be made for these types of movies, leading to the creation of Touchstone Pictures in 1984. Touchstone Pictures would last until 2016, and during its existence, the label allowed Disney to produce a wider array of films that would feel out of place under their traditional banner, and hopefully avoid the poor reception and bad box office of mismanaged, more mature fare like Dragonslayer or TRON. And during its 3 decades of existence, Touchstone found a lot of success with films that feel very akin to these darker live-action box office bombs. Movies like Splash, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, The Rocketeer, Con Air, Armageddon, Mission to Mars, Pearl Harbor, and Reign of Fire have that big-budget, broadly appealing, yet slightly less family-friendly feel to them that Disney had tried for years but could never make fully connect with audiences. Would Dragonslayer have been a hit if it had been released under Touchstone instead of Disney and Paramount? It's impossible to say, but as it stands, it's a compelling, if flawed piece of classic 80s fantasy. And for that alone, this is one hero's journey that any fan of the genre deserves to go on at least once. Thanks for watching today's video, and it's January, so you know what that means. It's time for a forgotten, dark, live-action Disney movie to be covered. You may have noticed this, but in past years I've talked about Fantasia, TRON, and The Black Hole. And so with January coming around once again, I wanted to do another dark Disney movie. And Dragonslayer popped out to me because it's one that I rarely see talked about. And when pairing that with ILM and a lot of famous, influential genius creators at the helm, I thought it would be really fun to talk about Dragonslayer. And so I hope that you enjoyed hearing about its history and creation, and maybe being compelled to watch it if you haven't before. It is currently available streaming for free in the US on Pluto TV, so really you don't need to pay anything to watch this movie. I know that a few years ago it finally came out in a big restoration with a big box of 4K discs. So that's really cool that they finally did that, but it still kind of feels like both Disney and Paramount are hiding this movie, which is a shame because I think it really deserves at least a stronger cult following. It's flawed, but it's pretty fun, and it really is dark 80s fantasy meets dark 80s Disney. Not mainstream appealing, but really unique. And like I said, the dragon itself is just a really cool creation, and still looks really unique. The really pointy snout and scaly spine and bat-like wings are a really unique approach to a dragon for its time, and have influenced a lot of dragons in the years since. So if you're a fantasy fan or a dragon fan, absolutely check this out. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Dragonslayer, your other favorite 80s fantasy movies, because I am interested in diving into more 80s fantasy with videos, and what other dark Disney movies you'd like for me to cover in future years, or maybe even later this year. As always, a huge thank you to my members and patrons for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a member or patron, it's only $2 a month for early access to every video, as well as exclusive member and patron only reviews, with this month's review chosen by my supporters to be covering The Princess Bride. So if you're interested in that, check it out. And until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and enjoying some great dark fantasy.